The first time Queen Isolde's shadow tried to kill someone for touching me, we were still at our wedding altar. I was a commoner in a borrowed ceremonial coat, standing beneath the banners of a kingdom that had been burning itself apart for 3 years. She was the cold queen everyone feared, the woman nobles called a tyrant when she refused their bribes and a savior when her armies protected their estates. That single moment told me our marriage would not be a romance first. It would be a battlefield wearing flowers. My name was Rowan Vale, though the court preferred calling me the miller's son, the peasant groom, or the temporary inconvenience wearing a crown by accident. I had not been chosen because of blood. I had been chosen because both sides of the civil war hated me equally. The rebellion began after the late king died without naming an heir the nobles liked. Isolde took the throne by law, then ruined every old family's plan by taxing their private armies, freeing debt prisoners, and placing common-born officers in royal command. Every banner above us felt less like decoration and more like proof that the kingdom was holding its breath. The North claimed she was destroying tradition. The South claimed she was not destroying it fast enough. The capital starved between them while old men argued about legitimacy over tables full of untouched food. I entered the war by accident. My village sat between 2 supply roads, so both armies tried to seize our grain. I refused both, organized the villages, and turned 5 mills into a neutral food route guarded by people too tired to care about noble banners. That should have gotten me hanged. Instead, it made me useful. Soldiers on both sides discovered that they could not kill me without losing bread. Priests called it providence. Merchants called it logistics. I called it not dying yet. The court could laugh at my birth all it wanted, but hunger had made my name harder to erase. Queen Isolde summoned me after my wagons fed 3 rebel hospitals and 2 royal forts in the same week. I expected chains. She offered tea. She sat behind a war table, pale and still, with a face so controlled it felt carved rather than born. Her shadow stretched behind her across the wall, too dark for the room's candles and too sharp at the edges to be natural. Isolde had inherited a throne already poisoned by old men who preferred ruin to sharing power. I noticed the shadow before I noticed the crown. It moved half a second after she did, like a loyal dog deciding whether obedience was worth the effort. When a minister leaned too close to her chair, it opened one eye. Every argument about legitimacy sounded noble until you counted the empty bowls beneath it. No one else reacted. That was my first warning that court survival depended on pretending impossible things were furniture. Isolde asked what price I wanted to keep the grain routes neutral. I said peace. She said peace was not a price. It was a consequence people demanded after refusing every payment required to reach it. Neutrality had not made me safe. It had only made everyone delay deciding how to use me. I told her she sounded tired. Every minister in the room looked like I had slapped the crown off her head. Isolde did not smile. Her shadow did. 3 days later, I was dragged into negotiations between the crown and the rebel dukes. I stood in the middle of men who had burned villages, hanged tax collectors, and then introduced themselves as patriots. By then I understood survival was mostly usefulness with better timing. Neither side trusted the other. Both sides trusted food, coin, and witnesses. Somehow I had become all 3. The first peace proposal failed before lunch. The second failed when a duke demanded Isolde abdicate. The third failed when Isolde asked whether he wanted the throne or simply the right to bankrupt it privately. That tea felt more dangerous than chains because chains at least admitted what they were. By sunset, the rebel envoy suggested marriage. Everyone turned to me. The shadow behind her made every candle in the room seem like it was lying about the light. I thought he meant someone noble. He meant me. A common husband beside the queen would prove she was not owned by the old houses. A neutral grain master beside the throne would reassure the hungry villages. A man with no army and no claim would not threaten either faction. A crown can distract most men, but I had spent too long watching dark roads for threats. It was the kind of political solution only exhausted people could consider reasonable. I refused immediately. Then a messenger arrived from the Western Front with news that 3 villages had been taken hostage by rebel riders who feared the treaty would end before they were paid. That single opening I told me the queen was not the only one judging me. Isolde's face did not change. Her shadow climbed the wall like smoke boiling upward. The room turned cold. Pretending not to see danger is one of the first skills palace people mistake for wisdom. The rebel envoy stepped back. I looked at the queen and realized she was calculating how many people she could save by becoming exactly the monster they accused her of being. So I said yes. Her answer sounded cruel until I realized she had probably paid every price peace had demanded and still been refused. Not because I loved her. Not because I wanted power. Because thousands of people were trapped between armies that needed a symbol stronger than pride. Isolde looked at me for a long moment. "Do not agree out of pity," she said. I spoke too honestly because commoners are rarely trained in the delicate art of useful cowardice. I said, "I'm agreeing because your nobles need a leash, your rebels need a bridge, and apparently I look enough like both." Her shadow leaned toward me. The wedding happened 7 days later. For a breath, it felt like the darkness had understood me better than the court did. The capital tried to celebrate while still counting dead. Flowers covered cracked stone. Bells rang over roofs patched from siege fire. Nobles wore smiles sharp enough to draw blood. Commoners watched from behind barriers, unsure whether to cheer or prepare for disappointment. Isolde walked toward me like an executioner approaching her own sentence. Those men called themselves patriots because traitor sounds less impressive on family banners. She said the vows clearly. I did too. When the high priest asked me to take her hand, I did not hesitate. That was when Duke Marwyn grabbed my shoulder from behind and whispered, "Remember your place, Miller's boy." My neutrality became valuable only because everyone had already run out of honest trust. Isolde's shadow rose from the floor. It became a black hand around the Duke's throat before anyone could scream. The negotiations taught me that civil wars do not end when people agree, but when they become too tired to posture. The Duke clawed at empty darkness as his feet left the ground. Isolde did not move. Her eyes widened by one fraction, the first honest emotion I had seen from her. The shadow whispered in a voice like silk dragged across a blade, "Touch him again, and I will decorate the chapel with your bones." The high priest fainted. The word marriage landed like a dropped blade, and somehow its edge pointed at me. I grabbed Isolde's wrist, because grabbing the shadow seemed impractical and suicidal. "Tell it to stop." Isolde's lips barely moved. "Release him." In that room, every powerful person suddenly found the commoner very convenient. The shadow tightened first. Then it dropped the Duke. My confusion must have shown, because several nobles looked almost entertained by my impending doom. Everyone pretended the coughing, collapsed noble had simply suffered from excitement. The ceremony continued because monarchy is apparently immune to common sense. After the vows, Isolde led me through a side corridor while guards blocked the gossip behind us. The proposal dressed itself as strategy, but it still smelled like a sacrifice. She said, "I apologize." I asked whether queens usually apologize for murder attempts performed by their shadows. She answered, "Only unsuccessful ones. Only a kingdom this broken could look at me and call me a solution." I laughed before I could stop myself. Her shadow turned toward me sharply, as if laughter was a weapon it had never studied. Refusing felt brave for approximately the length of one heartbeat. Isolde looked almost offended by my survival instinct. "You should be afraid." I said, "I am. But if fear fixed anything in this kingdom, the war would have ended years ago." The hostage report reminded me that ideals are expensive when other people are paying with their throats. For the first time, Isolde's mouth softened. Then the shadow slid between us and pressed itself against the wall, forming a silhouette of a woman with a crown made of thorns. Isolde's stillness was more frightening than panic because it meant she had already begun counting bodies. It whispered, "He smells like rain and flour. Keep him." Isolde closed her eyes. "Be silent." The shadow replied, "You never are." The cold in the room did not come from winter. It came from restraint cracking. That was the first sign that the shadow was not merely a curse. It was arguing with her. The court called it the Queen's Shade. An ancient royal magic passed through the ardent bloodline. Officially, it protected the sovereign from assassination. Unofficially, servants crossed themselves whenever Isolde's shadow stretched too far. I saw then that tyranny was sometimes just mercy after it had been denied every cleaner tool. On my first night in the palace, I was given a chamber connected to hers by a locked inner door. Political marriage, separate rooms, shared appearances. Civilized misery. I placed my travel bag on the bed and found the shadow already waiting in the corner. My agreement felt less like consent and more like stepping between two knives before they reach children. It had no full face, but I knew it was looking at me. I said, "Do you knock?" The crown offered power, but the villages offered a reason not to run. The shadow spread across the floor like spilled ink and wrote one word with its own body: mine. I opened the door and called for Isolde. She arrived with 3 guards, saw the word, and dismissed them so quickly they nearly collided in the hall. Her warning was the closest thing to kindness anyone had given me that day. The shadow curled around my boots. Isolde said, "It does not mean that." The answer made several nobles hate me instantly, which I counted as a small political success. I looked at the very clear word on the floor. She amended, "It should not mean that." The shadow's interest felt like a hand closing around a door I had not noticed behind me. I asked if it listened to her. Sometimes. 7 days is not enough time to prepare for marriage, war, or whatever waits inside a queen's shadow. That was not the comforting answer she seemed to think it was. The next morning, the marriage council began turning me into a symbol. I was placed beside Isolde during petitions, beside her at meals, beside her at public blessings, beside her in every painting sketch the court artists produced. Every time someone stood too near me, the room darkened. The celebration felt like paint over a wound that had not stopped bleeding. A maid adjusting my collar dropped to her knees when the shadow hissed from behind my chair. A young officer who clasped my hand too warmly during congratulations found black claws wrapped around his wrist. She carried herself like someone who had turned loneliness into posture. A princess from the eastern border kissed my cheek as a diplomatic greeting, and the shadow shattered every mirror in the reception hall. Isolde punished no one because technically no one had disobeyed an order. The problem was that part of her was issuing threats she refused to speak. Taking her hand felt less like romance than signing a treaty directly with disaster. I began keeping a list. Shadow dislikes. Touching, flirting, private letters, compliments lasting more than 6 seconds, portraits where I stand too far from Isolde, and any sentence containing the phrase annulment option. Duke Marwan's touch reminded me that nobles hear the word peace and immediately search for a hierarchy inside it. Shadow likes me eating properly, me standing on Isolde's left side, me disagreeing with ministers, me sleeping within 3 walls of the queen, and apparently cinnamon bread. I discovered the last one when it stole half my breakfast. Isolde denied that shadows could eat. The darkness rose with the speed of a thought Isolde had spent years refusing to speak. The missing bread argued otherwise. For 2 weeks our marriage worked politically. The hostage villages were released. 2 rebel dukes signed temporary oaths. Grain moved again. The capital stopped starving loudly and returned to starving politely. That was the moment everyone learned the queen's silence had teeth. Then the peace began demanding intimacy. Nobles wanted proof the marriage was real. Rebels wanted proof I was not imprisoned. Commoners wanted proof the queen could sit beside someone without turning him into policy. Marwan's terror spread through the chapel faster than any royal decree. So Isolde and I attended the harvest procession together. The city streets filled with lanterns, music, and people desperate for a reason to believe the war was ending. Children threw wheat petals at us. Old women shouted blessings. Soldiers from opposite sides stood along the same road and tried not to remember killing each other. Isolde's tiny reaction showed she feared her own shadow more than any enemy army. Halfway through the procession, a boy slipped past the guards and ran toward me with a small loaf of bread. I reached down to take it. The shadow struck first. The threat was so specific that even the candles seemed to reconsider burning. It wrapped around the child like a cage, not hurting him, but freezing him in place with black ribs of darkness. The crowd went silent. The priest's collapse was the most honest response anyone had given all morning. The boy began to cry. Isolde whispered, "No." My grip on Isolde's wrist felt absurdly small against a magic that could strangle dukes. The shadow snarled, "Trap." I stepped toward the cage. Isolde grabbed my sleeve. "Do not. If it thinks you are threatened, it may tighten." Her command sounded practiced, but the shadow's hesitation told me obedience was not guaranteed. I said, "Then tell it I'm not threatened." Her face went pale. "It does not believe me when I lie." That sentence stayed with me. It wanted to make a point before it accepted a boundary. I knelt before the shadow cage and looked at the terrified boy. "What's your name?" He whispered, "Finn." When Marwan hit the floor, every noble suddenly discovered a deep commitment to polite denial. I said, "Finn, I need you to throw the bread to me very slowly." His shaking hand moved. The ceremony moving on after attempted murder taught me more about court culture than any tutor could. The shadow tightened. I looked at it and said, "If you hurt him, I will never eat cinnamon bread again." The corridor felt blessedly empty, except for the impossible darkness following her like an unpaid debt. The black cage froze. Isolde stared at me. Her apology was too controlled, as if even remorse required royal discipline. The shadow released the boy. Finn threw me the bread and ran sobbing into his mother's arms. The crowd exhaled like the whole city had been underwater. If I did not joke, I suspected I would start shaking and never stop. I held up the bread, took one bite, and shouted that the queen's protection was so fierce even bread had to be inspected. People laughed because they wanted permission to survive the fear. Her answer was terrible enough to be funny, which was an unfair advantage. Isolde looked at me as if I had just disarmed a bomb by insulting it. That night, she came to my chamber without guards. My laugh broke something in the air neither of us knew had been waiting. The shadow followed behind her, stretched long and restless across the walls. Isolde said, "You should not have risked yourself." The shadow's reaction suggested I had either charmed it or offended it. Both options were dangerous. I said, "You married me to stop a civil war. Risk was in the dowry." She did not laugh this time. She asked why I was not demanding annulment. Fear was reasonable, but I had been living around unreasonable people for years. I said because the war would restart before the ink dried. The shadow whispered, "Because he likes us." My answer was reckless, but it was also the only language I still trusted. Isolde said, "He does not." I said, "I like parts of you." That softening was brief, yet it felt like finding a candle in a sealed tomb. Both the queen and the shadow went still. That was probably a dangerous thing to say. Unfortunately, it was true. The silhouette looked less like protection and more like a confession wearing a crown. I liked Isolde's honesty when she forgot to be royal. I liked that she never pretended peace was clean. I liked that she listened to petitioners no one important noticed. I did not like the strangling, threatening, mirror-shattering shadow. The shadow sulked so violently that the fireplace dimmed. I had been claimed by grain ledgers before, but never by living darkness. Isolde looked exhausted. "It is not separate from me." I asked what that meant. Isolde's command carried shame, not anger, and that difference mattered. She said every ardent ruler was born with a living shadow. It carried the sovereign's danger, instinct, and desire. In theory, it defended the crown. In practice, it grew stronger every time a ruler suppressed themselves for duty. Her father had taught her to starve it. The shadow's reply cut through the queen's composure with the cruelty of someone who knew every hidden room. A fair queen must not rage, must not want, must not fear, must not love too openly, must not admit loneliness, must not punish people because they hurt her feelings, must not cling to anyone. So Isolde placed everything unqueenly into the shadow. Once I heard them argue, I stopped thinking of the shadow as a weapon and started thinking of it as a witness. Every anger she swallowed, every fear she hid, every possessive thought she denied, every desire she refused to act on because fair rulers do not arrange laws around their hearts. Then I arrived, a husband chosen for peace, A man she could not command without proving the rebels right. A commoner who spoke to her like she was tired instead of untouchable. Calling it ancient magic made the court feel safer, because old terror sounds more respectable than current danger. The shadow lifted its head from the wall. "He saw us," it whispered. The separate chamber was supposed to reassure me, but locked doors have never made politics less intimate. Isolde looked away. That did more damage to me than any confession could have. Finding it already inside my room made the palace feel like a body that had rejected privacy. I asked if the shadow could be destroyed. She answered too quickly. Yes. Even without a face, its attention had weight. The shadow recoiled. I asked why she had not done it. Isolde's fingers tightened around her sleeve. Because destroying it would not remove only danger. If it could write, it could think. If it could think, we had a problem larger than superstition. The shadow laughed softly. It would remove wanting, warmth, hunger, the part of her that reaches. Isolde said nothing. That one word turned the stone floor into a marriage contract I had not signed. I understood then. The court wanted the shadow gone because it was dangerous. Isolde feared keeping it because it was honest. But killing it would turn her into the cold statue everyone already accused her of being. The next assassination attempt came 2 nights later. Calling Isolde felt childish until I remembered there is no dignified way to handle possessive architecture. A rebel loyalist disguised as a candle servant entered the council chamber during peace talks. He carried a needle dipped in nightglass poison and aimed for Isolde's hand. I saw the glint first and shoved her back. Her speed told me this was not the first time the shadow had expressed an opinion in public grammar. The needle entered my palm. The shadow went mad. It filled the chamber like a storm trapped indoors. Tables overturned. Candles died. Ministers screamed. The assassin was lifted against the ceiling, wrapped in black tendrils. The darkness around my boots felt almost affectionate, which was somehow worse. Isolde shouted for restraint. The shadow answered in a dozen voices. He bled. Her denial failed because the shadow had chosen excellent penmanship. My hand burned. Nightglass poison spread fast, turning veins black beneath the skin. Isolde grabbed me, all queenly composure gone. Stay awake. Watching a queen correct herself over a possessive shadow should have been funny. It was not. I said, "Is that an order?" She snapped, "Yes. Sometimes is the answer people give when they know the truth would start a riot." So I tried. The shadow lowered itself over my poisoned hand. For the first time, it touched me gently. Cold darkness entered the wound and pulled the poison out like ink drawn from paper. That answer ensured I slept facing the corner for the rest of the night. It hurt so badly I bit through my lip. Isolde held me through it, whispering apologies she would never have said in front of witnesses. Becoming a symbol is very similar to becoming furniture, except everyone argues about where to place you. When the poison finally left my blood, the shadow curled around my wrist like a bracelet. It whispered, "Ours was injured." The darkness responded to proximity like jealousy had become weather. I was too tired to correct the pronoun. The assassin survived, barely, because Isolde forced the shadow to release him. That mercy nearly destroyed negotiations. The maid's terror proved the palace staff understood the rules better than I did. The rebels claimed she staged the attack for sympathy. The nobles claimed her shadow was proof she was possessed. The priests requested permission to perform a royal severance rite. In plain language, they wanted to cut the shadow from her soul. The council voted in secret. The young officer learned that congratulations in the palace required very careful hand placement. I was not supposed to know. Maya would have hacked the records if she existed in this world. But I had only palace servants, bribed kitchen boys, and the fact that everyone underestimates a commoner carrying bread. The severance was scheduled for the next full moon. The princess's kiss broke mirrors. I added diplomacy to the list of dangerous sports. Isolde knew. She said nothing. Isolde's restraint protected people from law, but not from what she had buried beneath it. That angered me more than the council's betrayal. I found her in the old throne room at midnight, standing before portraits of ancestors whose shadows curled behind them like leashed beasts. Keeping a list made terror feel administrative, which was the only way I could keep breathing. I asked whether she planned to let them carve out half her heart for public comfort. She said, "If it saves the treaty." I said, "If the treaty requires you to stop being human, it's not peace. It's embalming." Somehow, writing down the shadow's preferences made it feel less supernatural and more like an impossible roommate. Her shadow rose behind her, larger than I had ever seen it. For once, it did not threaten me. The cinnamon bread entry worried me because it suggested negotiation might require pastries. It whispered, "Tell her." Isolde said, "Be quiet." I stared at the empty plate and considered whether my marriage needed a feeding schedule. The shadow continued, "Tell him you dream of locking every door so he cannot leave." Isolde flinched. Isolde's certainty was undermined by crumbs of evidence. "Tell him you hate the way diplomats smile at him. Tell him you imagine sending them to border posts with wolves. Tell him you remember every laugh he gives someone else." The shadow's voice broke into something almost young. "Tell him you want to be chosen without needing a kingdom as an excuse." Political success arrived quietly, like a wounded animal afraid of sudden movement. Isolde covered her ears. I stepped closer. The shadow did not stop me. Peace quickly discovered that symbols must perform or suspicious people begin sharpening knives again. I told her wanting terrible things did not make her guilty. Acting on them did. She looked at me like I had spoken treason against every lesson she had survived. Everyone wanted reassurance, but each faction demanded a different shape of lie. "A queen cannot afford terrible thoughts," she said. I answered, "Then no queen has ever been honest." The procession was our first test before a crowd too desperate to forgive another failure. The portraits on the wall seemed to darken. Isolde laughed once, sharply and without joy. "You think honesty is enough?" I said no. Honesty is the door. Discipline is walking through it without dragging someone else behind you. The city wanted to believe so badly that hope itself seemed dangerous. The shadow whispered, "We could drag him," pointed at it. "And that is why we need rules." Small hands are often what undo large political plans. Both Queen and Shadow stared at me. That was when I made my second stupidest proposal after agreeing to the marriage. Accepting bread should not have required courage, which shows how far the kingdom had fallen. I said I wanted to speak to the shadow alone. Isolde refused so quickly the torches flickered. The shadow moved faster than love, fear, or royal commands. The shadow naturally said yes. The old royal records mentioned a place called the Umber Court, the inner realm where ardent shadows lived when their rulers slept. No outsider had entered it and returned sane. Several had not returned at all. Isolde said entering it would give the shadow too much access to my mind. Finn became the smallest hostage in a war everyone claimed was ending. The shadow said, "He will finally hear us without her choking every word." I said that sounded necessary. Silence from a crowd can be heavier than shouting. Isolde grabbed my arm. Her fingers were shaking. "You do not understand what it is." I said, "I understand it is you." His tears reached me before any strategy did. She let go like the words burned. The full moon arrived before the severance rite. We had one night. The shadow trusted danger more than innocence because innocence had never protected Isolde. In the royal chapel, Isolde drew the old ardent sigil around us in ash and lamp oil. The shadow watched from every wall. She told me that if I became lost, I should follow my name. Shadows had difficulty imitating names spoken with love. Isolde's warning told me she understood the shadow's violence but not yet how to answer it. I asked if she would say it. Her face tightened. Then she whispered, "Rowan." Her admission revealed that the shadow was not fooled by royal performance. The shadow whispered it too, but differently, hungrily. The world dropped away. Some truths settle in you before you understand why they are important. I landed in a throne room made of black glass under a sky with no stars. Every torch burned with silver flame. The floor reflected versions of Isolde I had never met. Child Isolde standing alone after her mother's funeral. Princess Isolde swallowing tears as her father called softness a liability. Young Queen Isolde signing execution orders with a steady hand while her shadow screamed behind her. Kneeling was the only way to make myself less frightening than the darkness around him. The Umber Court was not a nightmare. It was a museum of everything she had not allowed herself to feel. Names matter when a child is about to become a symbol instead of a person. The shadow sat on the throne. Here it had a body shaped like Isolde and not shaped like her at all. Same face but wilder. Same eyes, but lit from beneath. Same crown, but broken into black antlers. It smiled when it saw me. Making the bread part of the rescue was foolish enough to work. Husband, it said. I said, shadow. Every movement of his hand made the entire street feel like a drawn bow. It looked offended. I have a name. I waited. My threat against cinnamon bread was the least heroic negotiation in royal history. It said, Nara. The name echoed through the court like a door unlocking. The shadow understood hunger more than mercy, and I used that shamelessly. Nara descended the steps and circled me. She never says my name. She pretends I am a tool, a curse, a stain. But when assassins come, whose teeth does she borrow? When nobles touch you, whose rage saves her from begging? I said, threatening children with darkness is not rage I'd brag about. Nara pouted. It was disturbing how much it resembled Isolde, refusing to admit irritation. Isolde's stare suggested she was revising her estimate of my intelligence downward and upward at once. The boy could have carried a blade. He carried bread. Finn running away alive was the best treaty sign that week. Bread can hide blades. I stared at her. Relief spread through the crowd like weather changing. Nara huffed. Fine. We overreacted. I nearly laughed, then remembered this creature had lifted a duke by the throat. Making people laugh saved us from becoming a horror story told in every market. I asked what she wanted. The Umber Court changed. Suddenly we stood in my palace chamber. The door was locked. The windows were sealed. Outside, voices called my name, but none reached me. Nara stood beside me, smiling. Isolde looked at me as if absurdity might be a form of statecraft. This, she said. I felt the trap in the fantasy. No war. No council. No diplomats. No villagers needing grain. Just me and the part of Isolde that wanted without shame. A queen visiting without guards feels less intimate when her shadow arrives armed. I said, that is not love. Nara's smile thinned. It is safety. The walls seemed too thin for what neither of them was saying. It is possession. Better possessed than murdered. Her concern sounded like scolding because she had no practice speaking fear gently. The chamber cracked, revealing another memory. Isolde at 17, holding her dying brother after a noble duel arranged for politics. She had loved him openly. The court used him against her. He died because enemies knew where to strike. Nara stood beside the memory, quiet now. I had learned that marriage to power means inheriting every danger power attracts. Everything she loves becomes a handle, Nara said. So she cut off her hands. Another memory appeared. Isolde refusing to visit a sick friend because the council would read affection as weakness. The friend died believing the queen had forgotten her. Her seriousness made my joke fall like a coin into deep water. Another. Isolde ordering a cousin imprisoned for treason while crying alone afterward, then forcing Nara to swallow the grief before dawn. Memory after memory, want after want, every feeling locked away until it grew claws. Annulment was no longer a legal question. It had become a match held near dry grain. I understood Nara then, and that was dangerous. Monsters become harder to fight when you know exactly who starved them. Nara had no patience for emotional ambiguity. Nara touched my cheek. Her fingers were cold, but careful. You feed us, she whispered. You make her laugh. You make her angry honestly. You stand near her and do not ask her to become marble. If you leave, she will starve me again. Isolde's denial arrived too quickly to convince either of us. I said Isolde had the right to be loved without caging the person offering it. Nara answered, Rights are paper. Fear is older. The answer escaped before I could dress it in diplomacy. The Umbra court trembled. Above us, in the waking world, the severance rite had begun early. When both Queen and Shadow go silent, a commoner should probably reconsider his life choices. Silver chains fell from the starless sky, wrapping around Nara's wrists. She screamed. Truth is especially dangerous when it is only partial. I heard Isolde scream too, somewhere beyond the realm. The priests had betrayed the timetable. The court around us split open, revealing Isolde kneeling in the chapel while priests drove silver nails through her shadow on the floor. I had begun seeing the woman behind the crown, and that made leaving more complicated. Nara's body began unraveling. For one heartbeat, I saw what would happen if the rite succeeded. Isolde would survive. She would rule. She would be fair, calm, merciful, and completely unreachable. Admitting what I disliked felt safer than pretending all darkness was romance. She would never threaten anyone over me again. She would never laugh because of me again either. The fireplace dimming proved the shadow took criticism very personally. I grabbed the nearest chain. It burned like winter lightning. Isolde's exhaustion sounded like someone finally lowering a sword she had held for years. Nara stared at me. Why? I said. Because killing desire is easier than teaching it manners. Then I pulled. I had asked a simple question and opened a door beneath the throne. The chain snapped. In the chapel above, one priest screamed as his ritual circle shattered. Ancient magic became far more tragic when she explained it as starvation. Nara fell forward into my arms, suddenly smaller, shaking like the child Isolde had never been allowed to remain. I said, "Take me to her." Her father had not trained a ruler. He had trained a prison guard for her own heart. Nara pressed her forehead to mine. The Umbra court became a hallway of mirrors. In every reflection, Isolde stood alone, crown on, hands empty, shadow missing. Every commandment of fairness had been sharpened into a knife against ordinary feeling. At the end of the hall, the real Isolde knelt behind a wall of silver light. She looked at me through it and whispered, "You should have let them finish." I said, "You don't get to decide that by yourself." She had mistaken suppression for justice because every adult around her rewarded the performance. She said, "I am dangerous." Nara laughed weakly beside me. "We are dangerous." The shadow was not born monstrous. It had been fed everything she was forbidden to be. I said, "Then we make rules." The silver wall cracked. My arrival did not create the problem. It gave the buried thing a name to reach for. I stepped between Isolde and Nara, which was stupid because they were two halves of the same soul and I was a flower-covered political accident with a burned hand. But sometimes being unqualified is the only reason you say the obvious thing. I represented freedom and danger in the same inconvenient body. I told Isolde that suppressing every desire had not made her fair. It had made her shadow dishonest on her behalf. I told Nara that protecting Isolde did not give her permission to own everyone Isolde cared about. Both looked offended. I felt the shadow's attention before I heard its words. Good. That meant both were listening. The Umbra court shook as the severance rite pushed harder. Being seen can save a person or ruin them, depending on what has been hidden. I said the rules out loud because shadows, queens, and councils all need witnesses. Rule 1. No harming anyone for touching me unless there is real danger. Her refusal to meet my eyes made me want to stay more than any confession would have. Nara opened her mouth. I added, "Jealousy is not danger." The question was cruel, but so was pretending removal was impossible. She shut it. Rule 2. No threats spoken through the shadow that Isolde is unwilling to be accountable for. Isolde flinched. Her answer made the shadow look less like a curse and more like something facing execution. Rule 3. Isolde must admit what she wants before Nara acts on it. Both halves went very still. The real reason mattered more than the method. Rule 4. I can leave a room, a conversation, or the palace without being followed by darkness. Nara growled. Her hand betrayed the fear her voice refused to carry. I looked at her. Growling is allowed. Blocking the door is not. She considered this like a predator evaluating a fence. Nara spoke with the bitterness of a creature that knew it was both hated and needed. Rule 5. If diplomats flirt with me, Nara may complain for exactly 10 seconds, silently, from the wall. Isolde stared. That is oddly specific. I said, we both know it will happen. Isolde's silence confirmed the cost better than any warning could. Nara smiled for the first time without showing teeth. Then Isolde spoke. Destroying danger is tempting until you discover it shares roots with tenderness. Her voice was barely audible. Rule 6. Rowan may tell me when I am using duty to hide fear. Nara looked at her. Assassination attempts in the palace have a way of clarifying everyone's priorities. Isolde continued. And I must listen before I command. The silver wall shattered. The candle servant's disguise proved that peace talks attract knives faster than blessings. Nara turned toward Isolde. For a moment I expected violence. Instead, the shadow knelt. Isolde reached out with trembling fingers and touched Nara's face. I acted before thinking because thought would have arrived too late. The Umbra court flooded with everything she had buried. Anger, longing, terror, loneliness, hunger, grief, and love. It should have crushed us. The needle entering my palm turned political danger into something painfully personal. Instead, Isolde breathed it in. Nara dissolved into her shadow again, not as a chained beast, but as a dark crown at her feet. The shadow's madness showed me exactly how much restraint Isolde had been forcing into silence. The starless sky opened. I woke in the chapel with my hand wrapped around a silver ritual chain and blood running from my nose. That chamber became a storm cloud filled with furniture and screaming ministers. Isolde lay beside me, gasping. Her shadow spread behind her, huge and silent. Isolde's command struck the darkness like a thrown chain. The priests backed away in horror. Duke Marwyn, somehow still alive and somehow still stupid, shouted that the queen was possessed and must be severed for the kingdom's safety. The shadow rose. The answer was not strategy, loyalty, or royal duty. It was outrage over my blood. Everyone froze. Isolde lifted one hand. Night glass made the veins look like ink spreading through parchment. The shadow stopped. Not easily, not politely, but it stopped. Her panic finally broke the statue everyone mistook for strength. Isolde stood with effort, crown tilted, face pale, and said, "The right is treason." The priests protested that they acted for peace. Even poisoned, I understood the danger of obeying a queen who sounded terrified. She answered, "Peace without consent is another form of conquest." Then she looked at me. I realized she was asking without asking. Trying was easier than admitting I wanted her voice to keep pulling me back. I nodded. Her shadow slid across the chapel floor and wrapped around the ritual tools, crushing them to dust without touching a single person. The gentleness of the shadow frightened me more than its violence had. Nara whispered from the wall, "We wanted to crush more." Isolde said, in front of the entire court, "I know." Pain returned with interest, as if the poison resented being evicted. The court heard that. So did I. It was the first time the queen took responsibility for the voice she had hidden. Her apologies felt stolen from a version of herself the court had never met. The severance conspiracy collapsed by morning. Priests were arrested. Duke Marwyn lost 3 titles and gained one very remote estate near a swamp. The rebel council, surprisingly, approved of punishing nobles who conducted soul surgery without permission. The treaty survived because everyone was too horrified to restart the war immediately. That bought us time. The bracelet of darkness around my wrist was both rescue and claim. Isolde used it ruthlessly. She announced the Shadow Edict, not to hide Nara, but to bind royal shadow magic under law for the first time in ardent history. I decided grammar could wait until after survival. Every royal command involving shadow force would require public record. No shadow punishment without declared cause. No soul severance rite without the sovereign's consent and 3 independent witnesses. No using ancient magic to settle personal insecurity. That last line was mine. Mercy saved the assassin but wounded the peace, which is how politics rewards restraint. The ministers tried to remove it. Nara growled from under the table. Every faction saw the same event and selected the explanation that sharpened its own knife. The line remained. Our marriage changed after that. Not magically, not perfectly, changed in the annoying, daily way that makes romance much harder than legend. Isolde began saying things she once forced Nara to carry. Calling it severance made soul mutilation sound almost hygienic. I am angry. I am afraid. Secret votes are where cowards dress violence in procedure. I do not want you to stand beside Ambassador Lyr for the entire banquet because she looks at you like you are a trade agreement with cheekbones. The first time she said that, I choked on wine. Being underestimated had become my only consistent political resource. Nara laughed from the wall for 5 uninterrupted minutes. The rules were tested constantly. The full moon suddenly felt less like a date and more like a deadline. A general clasped my forearm too long after a victory report. Nara rose halfway, remembered Rule 1, and flattened herself into the floor while muttering murder suggestions only the carpet could hear. A diplomat from the coast complimented my hands. Isolde said, very calmly, that my hands were not currently part of trade negotiations. Nara lasted 8 seconds before growling. Her knowledge and silence together felt like betrayal against herself. Progress. The kingdom noticed. I could forgive secrecy from enemies more easily than surrender from her. At first, people feared the queen's shadow more because now everyone knew it had opinions. Then they saw Isolde stop it. The old throne room held generations of rulers who had mistaken leashes for control. They saw her correct herself in council. They saw her admit anger before making judgment. They saw me leave rooms without being dragged back by darkness. Slowly, the story changed. Her willingness to sacrifice herself sounded noble until I heard the emptiness beneath it. The cold queen was not cured. The monstrous shadow was not slain. The commoner husband was not devoured, imprisoned, or quietly replaced by a more dignified noble. We became something far more politically inconvenient. Functional. The civil war ended in pieces. A signed bridge treaty here. A grain reform there. A hostage exchange. A tax concession. A public funeral for both sides where Isolde stood beside rebel mothers and did not hide when they cursed her. The treaty was important, but I refused to let peace become another executioner. Nara hated the curses. Isolde let them land. The shadow's size revealed how much terror her calm face had been hiding. I loved her most in those moments, though I did not say it yet. Love, in a palace full of spies and shadows, is best introduced carefully, preferably after checking the walls for ears and teeth. That silence from the darkness felt like permission. Nara knew anyway. One night, as I reviewed grain ledgers in my chamber, the shadow wrote on the floor, "Say it." Nara pushed the words out because Isolde would rather bleed internally than ask for help. I said, "I'm working." It wrote bigger, "Say it." I spilled ink on a tax report. Isolde's command was automatic, tired, and utterly useless. Isolde arrived moments later, saw the floor, and turned bright red for the first time in recorded royal history. She whispered, "Nara." Each confession struck her like a slap from her own hidden heart. The shadow formed a smug crown shape. I looked at Isolde and suddenly the war, the treaty, the altar, the poison, the shadow realm, and every ridiculous rule fell into place. Jealousy sounded ridiculous until I remembered it had been locked in darkness for years. I said, "I love you." The room went silent. The shadow's voice carried loneliness sharp enough to cut through its threats. Isolde looked like a queen facing an army with no shield. Nara, who had threatened dukes and shattered mirrors, whispered, "Again." I stepped closer, slowly enough that both halves could let me. That last desire was the wound beneath every monstrous reaction. "I love you," I said again. "Not because of peace. Not because of the crown. Not because your shadow would eat anyone else who tried." Nara murmured, "We would consider nibbling." She covered her ears like a child trying not to hear herself. Isolde said, "Be quiet," but she was crying. Approaching her felt less like bravery than refusing to abandon someone mid-confession. She touched my hand with careful permission, as if after all the darkness, choice was still the holiest thing between us. "I love you too," she said. The difference between thought and action became the only bridge available to us. Nara rose behind her like wings. Then, very quietly, the shadow added, "We loved you first." I decided not to argue with the living embodiment of suppressed royal desire. She had been taught that inner ugliness was the same as public guilt. Years later, historians would claim our marriage stabilized the kingdom through symbolic unity, agricultural reform, negotiated military integration, and the domestication of royal shadow magic. Historians are paid to make chaos sound intentional. My answer was treasonous only because her kingdom had outlawed honesty in queens. The truth was Messier. Our marriage survived because a queen learned to speak before her shadow screamed. A shadow learned that protection without consent was just fear wearing armor. And a miller's son learned that marrying into monarchy requires excellent reflexes. The portraits looked accusing, but dead monarchs are poor advisors on living hearts. The shadow never disappeared. Destroying it would have made Isolde easier for the court to accept and impossible for me to love fully. She wanted a solution clean enough for law. People are rarely that convenient. So Nara remained, under rules. Mostly, the door of honesty was open, but neither half knew how to step through without claws. When diplomats flirted with me, the wall still darkened. When old nobles touched my shoulder too familiarly, the candles still leaned away. Nara's interruption proved my point with almost theatrical timing. When I left for village inspections, Nara followed me to the gate and growled until Isolde told her I knew the road home. But the doors stayed open. Rules were less romantic than devotion, which made them much more trustworthy. The road stayed mine, and every time I returned, Isolde stood in the throne room with her shadow at her feet, both pretending they had not been waiting. They stared because no one had ever suggested governing the shadow instead of killing or hiding it. One autumn evening, Ambassador Elwire visited again and complimented my smile. The entire banquet hall went black for exactly 10 seconds. No one screamed. This was considered diplomatic progress. My proposal was stupid, but at least it was not cowardly. When the light returned, Isolde was sipping wine with perfect dignity. Nara's voice whispered from beneath the table, 7 seconds next time. Her refusal shook the room before the magic did. I laughed. Isolde sighed like a woman cursed with both a kingdom and a conscience. Nara's agreement was too eager, which usually means a plan is necessary and terrible. Then she reached for my hand in full view of the court. Her shadow did not grab first. The Umber Court sounded like the sort of place history mentions only after cleaning up bodies. It waited. I chose to take her hand. That was the peace we built in the end. Isolde's fear for me was no longer hidden well enough to be mistaken for politics. Not a kingdom without darkness. Not a queen without hunger. Nara wanted a witness. I wanted the part of Isolde no throne room would allow. Not a love without jealousy, fear, or sharp edges. Just 3 impossible things sharing one promise. The queen, her shadow, and the commoner who had somehow survived being loved by both. Necessary is the word fools use when they are already walking toward danger.